Everyone, good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to the first session of DFIN 511, Introduction to Digital Currencies. Thank you all for joining today. This is a 12-week course. This will be the first session of the 12-week course. It will be co-taught by me and Andreas Antonopoulos. As most of you know, this course was the first course ever taught in the world on the topic of cryptocurrency. We are now in the 7th running of this course. Several thousand students have gone through this course, and I want to welcome you to it. You are still in a group that is among the cutting edge of academia. You are among the first several thousand people to study this topic in world history at any university in any capacity. The folks that have gone through this course have gone through to do many interesting things, either in their personal or professional capacity, and some of them have continued on to complete the Masters in Digital Currency of the University of Nicosia. If you do complete this course and decide to proceed to the Masters and get a sufficiently high grade in this course actually accounts for the first course in the Master's program. So you will receive credit for the first course in the Master's program. Even if you do not go through to the Master's, if you complete the exercises, get a sufficiently high score on the final examination, you will earn a certificate that will be written into the blockchain. These certificates, starting from the first MOOC, were the first academic certificates written into the blockchain. We believe they still are the only academic certificates written to the blockchain, though from our understanding, it sounds like MIT might be starting in a few months as well for some of their coursework. So you still have the chance to be a part of early permanent history, where your participation in this course is recorded for, if not eternity, quite a long time on the blockchain. The way we tend to handle these sessions is students have submitted a set of questions in advance. I give priority to the questions that have been submitted in advance. We try and go through them. If we finish with sufficient time in the hour-long session to handle other questions, we will address those as well. But I do tend to give priority to the questions that were submitted in advance. You might have already met George Babayoyu. He is an integral member of our digital currency team. He helps with every aspect of the program, and he is the day-to-day heart and soul of this course. So if you have specific questions, if you have specific problems, if you want someone to go through specific issues with, he's the guy to reach out to. In terms of the course structure itself, 6 sessions are taught by me, 6 sessions are taught by Andreas Antonopoulos. As a general rule, I will teach the more theoretical, financial, practical, legal, regulatory modules. Andreas will teach the more technical modules, including both the computer science theory that underlies Bitcoin and also practical exercises on how to use Bitcoin wallets and so on. Andreas, I'm sure a lot of you already know who he is. He is one of the greatest advocates for cryptocurrency in the world. He's a huge evangelist on the topic. He spends, as far as I can tell, his whole life evangelizing specifically for cryptocurrencies and open financial systems of this type, traveling around the world. And so we're always very fortunate to have him participate in this course. A little bit more introduction to the program and to the university before I get into the questions. Some of you might know this. For those that don't, it might be helpful. This program is run by the University of Nicosia. The University of Nicosia is the largest university in Cyprus. It's the largest university anywhere in Southern Europe that teaches in English. We focus on several areas. We're a comprehensive university, but we're particularly strong in medicine, in accounting, in architecture, and international relations. And most relevantly for this program, we believe, and many others have, including industry publications or other folks in academia or in industry, believe we're the university who has done the most work in broad cryptocurrency education anywhere in the world. There's been several rankings that came out in this regard, and there's a ton of great work happening also at Stanford and at Princeton and Cornell and at MIT. But I think we today still have the most comprehensive effort in this area. We were the first to teach a course. We were the first to run an academic degree program. We were the first to have graduates from an academic degree program. We were the first to write academic certificates in the blockchain. And what we were initially known for, we were the first university to accept Bitcoin for tuition, and I think still one of only a handful that do that. Why do we do all these things? Why are we interested in this topic? We're going to cover some quite specific topics about digital currency in this course and in this particular MOOC, but our assessment from 2013 that still stands today, we believe the computer science aspects underlying Bitcoin are a fundamental breakthrough in computer science. Next week, you will learn about the Byzantine generals problem from Andreas Antonopoulos and how Bitcoin, under a reasonable set of conditions, actually solves that long-standing problem in distributed systems, and what this means in practice, what this means in terms of implications and applications, is that anywhere you have today a centralized database, a centralized ledger, which is practically everywhere in modern life, this type of technology gives the opportunity for it to become decentralized, for it to work in an open and decentralized manner. The best analogy to think about is what the internet and TCP/IP and the web did for communications. It used to be a very centralized process. You needed a printing press, you needed a TV license, you needed a broadcasting station. Now people around the world can communicate in all types of manners that don't necessarily have a central gatekeeper, an editor-in-chief, a program station chief. This will do the same thing for value. Value in digital currency, it might be money. Value in title deeds might be the title of the houses. Value might be hotel reservations. It might be digital rights management. But this will allow these activities to be decentralized across parties across the world. If that's the case, and we're certain it's the case, then we're talking about a 20-year revolution across a variety of areas. We are only at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning in this topic area. And in most cases, we likely don't even know today what the real applications are going to be. If you think back to the fact the internet was invented in some capacity in 1969 with DARPA. Email was invented in the mid-'80s. The email protocol, SMTP, was invented in the mid-'80s. We didn't have Gmail until 2008, if I'm not mistaken. We didn't have Uber till 4 or 5 years ago. And so today we are as far away from what the full applications of digital currency and blockchain technology are going to be as someone in the early 90s, when the web started coming into fruition, was from Uber and Twitter and Google Hangouts as we are today. Everyone knew back then that this would decentralize communication, that it would be a big deal. But it took a lot of work, a lot of development, a lot of time for people to be able to do the work technically, but also more importantly, be able to envision conceptually what was the work that needed to be done. This is the introduction. This is why we're super excited about it. We want to welcome you to our community. We hope you do a great job in this MOOC. We hope some of you who are interested continue on to do the master's degree. It's a great program. The new class is starting this February with 30 students. Every semester it's been growing, and we just have a fabulous time with those groups. They're really interesting people from around the world doing all types of great work and getting great jobs afterwards, broadly speaking, in the digital currency or blockchain field. Even if you don't continue with the master's, I'd like to encourage you to stay part of the University of Nicosia community in general and the digital currency community at the University of Nicosia specifically. We've gathered together indirectly or directly a very large chunk of the folks who are interested in this topic. And it is a community, and it's something where around the world we'd love to exchange ideas, thoughts, etc. about how we can develop this further. George, if there's nothing else that I need to cover on the introduction side, I'm going to jump in to the questions. If there's something I've missed, give me a chat. And if you could also throw up a link for me with the live chat that everyone's on, it'd be helpful for me to see it. Okay, give me 1 second. Ooh. I need to silence my phone. Okay, great. Oh, I'm on the live chat. Wow, what a great group. I am looking through people from New York, Chile, San Diego, New York, Zurich, Ontario, Tonton, Netherlands, Santiago, Lagos, Cyprus, London, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, Dublin. Wow, that is just fantastic. I love this. Okay, everyone, I'm going to jump into the questions. First question. A lot of people are of the view that Bitcoin is a money or a currency spent by men of the underground. How true is this opinion? I am very comfortable saying this is not a particularly true statement. And let me describe that from a couple of dimensions. How many of the usage cases of digital currency have to do with underground, and what does the underground use in practice? On the first case, as I had mentioned, digital currency, specifically this type of technology more generally, is a super broad space. You have people doing anything from remittances to digital right management for music and everything in between using this technology. So the early days that 2012, 2013, where people said, oh, this is going to be for drug dealers or money launderers, I think we've long surpassed that. Everyone has recognized that there are many legitimate usage cases, and the overwhelming majority of time, money, financing, effort into Bitcoin is for those legitimate usage cases. What's even more compelling, though, is the flip side. Central banks have studied this issue, and they have looked at, on a risk factor basis, what are the mechanisms that people use in order to engage in black market criminal activities, and what's the relative risk factor that people are concerned about. By a wide margin, the overwhelming majority of illegal activity is conducted in cash, and it is conducted specifically in US dollars and secondarily euros. In the list of 14, I think it was the European Central Bank, or actually the UK Central Bank, listed 14 different topics, mechanisms for illegal activity. And cryptocurrencies were the last on the list, the least concerning on the list. Part of the reason for that is that cryptocurrency is not actually a fabulous way to engage in criminal activity, because it actually leaves a record. If I'm trying to conduct an illegal transaction in cash, I'm at risk at the moment that the transaction's happening. So if you're a police officer and you find me at the time that I am buying a shipment of drugs in cash and you catch me in the act, there's the drugs, there's the cash, you're in, or I'm in trouble. After that moment, though, it's actually very hard to trace back the cash and where it came from. Cash is pretty easy to break up into bits and pieces, spend it in different ways, and have it disappear into the system. Bitcoin's different. All transactions are recorded forever on the blockchain. So all that needs to happen in law enforcement is for one person some point in the blockchain to make a mistake, run through a place where their identity is found out, be caught on camera, what have you, and then you can trace back all the transactions. And so people who are thinking that Bitcoin is a particularly smart way to engage in illegal activity or do things that law enforcement is not meant to find out about are misguided. It's actually not a particularly good way to do that. It is not an anonymous system. It is at best pseudonymous, and in many cases, it's not anonymous at all. So I think it's safe to say this is not primarily a currency for the underground, and I wouldn't recommend it if you're a member. If we have any members of the underground here in our audience, I would not recommend that you use Bitcoin for your criminal activities. Bitcoins are deflationary as a currency, and it's a question, I suppose, but it has an exclamation point. Some economists argue that Bitcoin is a deflationary currency due to the fact that there are a limited number of coins, 21 million by 2140. Based on that, the expected purchasing power of Bitcoins in the future will rise. So why do people need to spend the money today? Will this, from an economist perspective, raise unemployment and increase poverty? I have this question every single time we teach this class. Let me answer it two ways. First of all, the question of will it increase unemployment and will it raise unemployment and increase poverty, will it have macroeconomic effects, is only relevant if it is the unit of account of a country. So I agree with you that if I was the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, or the ECB, or the Central Bank of Japan, it would be a very bad idea for me to run my currency in a deflationary perspective. Why is that? If every year you think goods are going to get cheaper, you are very likely to try not to consume now because you can buy whatever you're going to buy cheaper later. If everyone doesn't consume because they're waiting to use the money later, then producers get desperate, they drop prices, everyone says, oh, look, prices are falling even further, let's wait before spending money, and so on and so forth. It works out really poorly for an economy. It represses consumption and therefore GDP growth. So I agree, deflationary currencies are a bad idea if they are the unit of account for a country, if everything is measured in, let's say, dollars. When something is not the unit account of a country, it's some type of asset. So if you are, for example, shares of Apple are deflationary. One share of Apple stock buys a lot more goods and services than it did 10 years ago, but it has no macroeconomic effect because we don't buy televisions denominated in shares of Apple. We don't get paid in shares of Apple. We don't run the whole US financial system in shares of Apple. So this is something that is not the unit of account for a country, is not going to be macroeconomically deflationary in any case. It doesn't actually matter from that perspective, even if it is deflationary as an asset, right? So when assets go up in value, we don't tend to talk about them as being deflationary. We tend to just talk about them as the asset without value, because they're not deflationary, because you don't measure the economy in those assets. Next point, if you are certain that Bitcoin is going to go up, well, you're actually incorrect to be certain. The fact that it is limited in value limited in number does not necessarily mean it will go up in value. And we will do a very easy demonstration of this topic right now. While there are 21 million Bitcoins, there are now only 3 Polemitis coins. 1, 2, 3. Does this mean these 3 pieces of paper are going to become highly valued in the future just because there are not that many of them? No, of course not, because there has to be some actual demand for them. It's got to be some reason you want them. And so the fact that Bitcoin in and of itself is limited in number is a necessary condition for a private currency to work. Because if it wasn't limited in number, and if it wasn't hard limited in number, no one would rely on it at all, because you'd be concerned that the centralized promoter would then explain things and would then expand the number of Bitcoins available and make money for him or herself. So it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient. Just having a small number of things doesn't mean those things are going to have any particular value. So, to summarize, when something is not the currency of a country and it's not the unit of account for a country, we don't think of it as deflationary, because it isn't, because it doesn't have these macroeconomic effects to think about. If something goes up in value and is thought of more as an asset, your house goes up in value, your Apple stock goes up in value, a barrel of oil goes up in value, we think of it as that way. It just goes up in value. And for anything to go up in value, including Bitcoin, you need to look at both supply and demand. We know the supply of Bitcoin. What we don't know is the demand. If Bitcoin continues to be useful and create usage cases and people want to use it for various purposes, then the fact that it has a limited supply will likely push its price up. If Bitcoin does not make the case that there should be good usage cases for Bitcoin, or if other alternatives to Bitcoin emerge, the fact that its supply is limited is not sufficient to drive its price up. In all, I spend 0 time worrying that Bitcoin is deflationary and will impact the economy, even though I hear this comment or I read this comment in articles for several years that some people will worry about it. It is absolutely a red herring. Next question, hyperinflation. How does a country recover from severe hyperinflation? Usually via some form of shock therapy. You generally replace the currency. You start over. You lop several zeros off. And hyperinflation tends to happen when the country keeps issuing more and more currency. Typically how you get in this cycle is you have needs, you're in war, you're in poverty, something's problematic. The government issues more currency in order to meet the spending requirements that they want. And that works temporarily, but then it devalues the currency, so then they need more of it, and you get into this bad cycle. Realistically, you never work your way back organically from that. If you get to the point where a loaf of bread costs 1 trillion German marks, you're not going to just work your way back. It's then going to cost 900 billion German marks, then 800 billion, then 5 million, and then 2. People tend to start over, either with a brand new currency or just lopping off all the zeros, which It's weird. It's just a psychological hack, but it does seem to work. You feel less hyperinflationary if you're spending 9 of something instead of 9 billion of something. But then you have to stop the cycle of issuance. One way that you start over with a new currency is you sometimes peg externally. Maybe you're pegging to gold, or what you see actually quite often is pegged to another more stable currency. When it's done with dollars, it's called dollarization. Zimbabwe did this for a while and just said, like, look, well, we're just going to use dollars. Right? And they even pegged. They said, we'll just use dollars. And that works for a while. And then I think they've now slipped back again, and they're issuing notes from the government that's a form of pseudo-currency. You have to be disciplined. You have to take the pain. You have to say that I'm not issuing anymore. And, usually in a hyperinflationary environment, it just becomes untenable. The economy collapses on itself. Either the government comes with senses, or I think in many cases you actually end up changing governments, and then the new government changes policy. Can you elaborate on Gresham's law in relation to Bitcoin? Gresham's law, for those who don't know it, is the idea that bad money chases out good money until you're only left with bad money. And what does this mean? Think about when you had commodity money, silver coins. And let's say we agreed that a silver coin that is measured as 100 grams of silver. And, if it's 99 grams of silver or 98 grams of silver, you can probably get away with it because no one's going to notice in day-to-day activity. So there's an incentive to shave off a little silver and put it into the system. So now you have bad money in the system and good money in the system. Right? The 100 is the good, the 98 is the bad, the 95 is the bad. Well, everyone is going to want to try and keep the good money, the 100, get rid of the bad money, the 90. The 100s come out of circulation, the 90s go into circulation, or people then put 90s into circulation, and then you end up only with bad money. I believe this is wholly inapplicable to Bitcoin because there is no ability to change the dimensions. I mean, it's a weird concept for a digital object. The dimensions, the value, or so on of a Bitcoin. A Bitcoin is a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin. So there's no real concept, I believe, of bad Bitcoins and good Bitcoins and the bad ones chasing out the good ones. Next question. Is limiting the number of Bitcoins and or cryptocurrency the best cryptocurrencies, so having multiple cryptocurrencies, the best strategy for not behaving like a fractional reserve-backed currency? I've been wondering if this is the best strategy to fix rather than bump up the number of Bitcoins and make the algorithms to mine much harder. I'm going to argue that the fractional reserves have close to nothing to do with the number of Bitcoins. And it has to do with, in the case of Bitcoin, if you're holding the underlying Bitcoin itself. And if you're not, there can be fractional reserve banking either on purpose or inadvertently. Let's say Bitcoins, there are 21 million Bitcoins. And we pass them around, and I move it from me to you, and George to me, and me to George, and George to Jeremy, and Jeremy to Jerry, and Jerry to Perry, and Perry to Kelly. Just reading through the live chat. That Bitcoin is a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin. Let's say, though, I say I'm going to start a Bitcoin bank. And I say, George, lend me your Bitcoin. I'm going to pay you a Bitcoin interest rate. And then I say to people, I am going to lend out something. Something that's represented by Bitcoins. It's an IOU of sort, and then people are going to spend it. There, you can, on purpose or inadvertently, declared or undeclared, replicate fractional reserve banking, because then you're holding something that's not quite a Bitcoin. And so then the limits don't apply, whatever the limits are. So let's be more specific about this. If you have your Bitcoins at an exchange and you log into your account and your account says you have 20 Bitcoins, you do not have 20 Bitcoins. You do not have physical possession of 20 Bitcoins. What you have is an IOU from the exchange to you that is denominated in Bitcoins. You are most likely, legally speaking, an unsecured creditor of the exchange. By the way, and most people don't realize it, this is how their bank works. When you go and deposit 200 euros in your bank account, and then your bank statement says you have 200 euros or $200, most people, as a simplification, think to themselves, oh, right, they have the 200 euros, I gave it to them, it has my name on it. I mean, obviously not those specific 200 euros, but there's a 200 euros there, and when I want them, I can get them back. And 99.99% of the time, the reality behaves like that simplification. But that simplification is not the truth. The truth is you do not have $200. You have an IOU from the bank denominated in dollars. You're a creditor of the bank. And before deposit insurance, bank runs happened all the time when people said, well, I suspect I don't really have this money. The bank doesn't, it's lent out more than it's taken in, and the loans aren't performing, and it won't be able to service its obligations to its customers, and everyone starts withdrawing, and everyone is going to ask for the money once, and they don't have it, and oh my God, they have a bank run. Deposit insurance ended that on the whole in advanced economies. But here in Cyprus in 2013, we got to see in action the truth. When there was a funding needs for certain Cypriot banks, and the European Central Bank and the European Union did not want to finance those funding needs, and they suggested the solution, and part of the quote-unquote bailout, was a bank deposit haircut. And so, if you had above the deposit insurance limit, if you had $1 million in the Bank of Cyprus, and the insurance limit was about 100,000, let's say if €1 million was about 100,000 euros, everything above 100,000 was subject to a haircut. In the Bank of Cyprus, it was a haircut of about 50%. In Laiki Bank, which was the other big bank, it was 100% haircut. So if you had 100,000 in the bank the night before the haircut, you had 100,000 the next day. If you had 101,000, you had 100,000. If you had $500,000, you had 100,000. If you had 10 million, you had 100,000. Because, and it's weird, it's not like the money vanished overnight. The money was never there in the first place. You did not have, there's not some big pile of cash in the bank. You have a liability. The bank, you have loaned, you have an asset, the bank has a liability. It's a liability from the bank to you, it's your asset. You have loaned money to the bank. And it's an IOU from the bank to you. So, with this concept in mind, you could have a bank that issues IOUs that are theoretically backed by your Bitcoins, and they're fractionally reserved. Now, if you're using the underlying Bitcoins itself, then no, you can't do that. You're going to have the actual Bitcoin. But that's like saying, can you have fractional reserve banking if you're holding cash? If you're holding cash, no, you can. You're holding cash. If you have $100 bill, I have a $100 bill. So I believe it has nothing to do with the underlying protocol. It has nothing to do with how many Bitcoins there are. Fractional reserve banking happens at a level above in the financial system. Someone explains to me what's the difference between money and a currency. Where does Bitcoin fall in this? Are they part of money? Are they a currency? Currency is a subset of money. It's a subset where it's frequently used for the medium of exchange within a certain geographical boundary, is what you'd think historically. So money is any way you can settle debts. Currency is a frequent medium of exchange in a geographical area. I think Bitcoin's interesting because it's not really limited geographically in any way, and it's not tied to any place geographically. It's certainly a medium of exchange. I think it is a currency, but it's a currency that's a relatively unusual form. It's not like most prior currencies. Part of what you realize the more you spend time with Bitcoin, it is like the elephant in the fable, that someone touches it on the trunk and says, oh, it's like this, and someone touches on the leg and something else, and someone touches it on the tail, and you say, like, is Bitcoin a currency? Yes and no. And is Bitcoin an asset? Yes and no. And is Bitcoin a commodity? Yes and no. And is Bitcoin commodity money? Yeah, sort of. So I kind of think it is. And is Bitcoin a network? Yes and no. And so it really doesn't fit very cleanly into the existing categories we use to describe financial or technological things. And so it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you see completely contradictory rulings. So in the United States, the IRS looked at Bitcoin and said, great, this is a asset. And then the commodities, no, this is a commodity. And then someone else in Germany said, oh, it's a currency. And Israel said, no, it's not a currency. And I mean, nothing's different in how they're evaluating it. It's just a question of which aspect you emphasize more than the other, noting that it doesn't fully match the existing definitions. While fiat currencies have their challenges, the concept of a store of value and legal tender is established by the government. I am not an expert, but I would think the value of each unit of the currency is backed by quantifiable means, GDP, economic growth, etc. The Bitcoin ledger is a service not backed by an underlying asset, which allows people to transact Bitcoins in an open distributed platform. I am not clear how Bitcoin derives value for offering a marketplace to transact its own coin. Are we saying the 21 million Bitcoin is the monetized value of the blockchain technology? This is a deep rabbit hole question that we've spent a lot of time into, like, you know, how even conceptually do you determine what the value of a Bitcoin? Why does a Bitcoin have value? What is it? And where you end up on this topic is that all currencies derive, and this is self-referential, but I think it's the case, derive part of their value from the fact that they're a currency. And that sounds like it's self-referential, it's snake eating its tail, but I think it's all true. People say, well, no, take gold. Gold has real utility. Gold's market price far exceeds any of its industrial utility, right? Gold's market price, embedded in gold's market price is the fact that gold is valuable because gold has been valuable. Now, why is gold valuable in the first place? It meets, as a currency, it meets many of the definitions of a good currency. It's scarce, it's fungible, it doesn't spoil, it's relatively easy to transport, so on and so forth. But part of the reason it carries value as a currency, and it's been carrying it for several thousand years, is because it carries for several thousand years. And so part of the market value of gold is that it can function as a form of money or a form of currency. And it's self-referential in that regard. Same thing is true for national currencies, for sovereign currencies. The US dollar, the only thing it is formally backed by, you can take it to the treasury and get another US dollar. Weird, right? Like it's one of those weird mind tricks. The US government stands behind dollars by giving dollars. It's certainly not directly backed by US GDP, right? Like you can't show up with $1 and say, there are so many $1 trillion in circulation and US GDP is 14 trillion or whatever it is this year, 15 trillion. And I'm holding one of the 2 trillion US dollars. So I have 1/2 trillionth of US GDP represented here. And can you give me some underlying assets that represent 1/2 trillionth of the US GDP? But you can take your dollar, clean, dirty, ripped, etc., to the Federal Reserve, they'll give you back another dollar. Now, is US GDP somehow related to the value of the dollar? Sure. If the US was a basket case, if it had a poorly functioning economy, if it had a poorly functioning system of governance, if it had a poorly functioning central bank, if you were worried that the country would be overrun by its neighbors and the dollar would disappear completely, if you're worried the country would stop producing anything and have no economic power, if you were worried that the company would have issues meeting its obligations and would print money to meet them, all of those would make dollars less valuable. I think almost obviously so. And so then the flip side is those things not happening makes dollars more valuable. But it makes them more valuable in a quite indirect manner. I believe it makes them more valuable primarily because of the stability. You expect that there will be a stable amount of demand for dollars, a stable amount of places that will accept dollars, including the United States, which gives you a quarter of the global economy on day one as a place where you can spend your dollars. So I mean, imagine you had a very good central bank and a very careful monetary policy, but you were, I don't know, Cyprus or Malta or the Seychelles. It's hard for you to become the global reserve currency. You're not the demand and supply for a global reserve currency will swamp your economy. Here, dollars are absorbed in and out of the US economy on an ongoing basis, and that's a quarter of global GDP. And because people ultimately can rely on dollars being spendable there, they also accept them abroad, and they're willing to trade in them, and they're willing to settle in it, and it tends to be a relatively stable value. And so those things do back the dollar, but they don't back in any direct way. In the same way of indirectly backing Bitcoin, I think, yes, it is a form of the monetized value of the blockchain technology, but let me explain what I think that means. Let's take two scenarios. Nobody ever develops anything useful to do with Bitcoin. It's a cool computer science exercise. And by anything useful, I mean applications of the type, let's use it for micropayments, or applications of the type, hey, I want to hold some wealth digitally that I can access digitally around the world. So imagine that's the two of those applications. If there are various applications for it and a limited number of Bitcoins, and certain people have the Bitcoins on day one, and then someone wants to engage in one of those applications that you can do with Bitcoin, and therefore needs to buy some Bitcoins in order to make those applications, well, then they have to induce the person who's holding the Bitcoins to give them to the person who wants to use them for the application, in which case they're going to have to trade something of value to get the Bitcoins. Where exactly that price, that something of value is supply and demand. Depending how many Bitcoins are, depending how much demand is, it will go up and down. If there is absolutely nothing of value you can do with a Bitcoin, no applications you can use with no sense that it's a way to store digitally accessible wealth, then regardless of how many Bitcoins there are in circulation, it's like my 3 Polemitis coins here, worth 0. So is there a direct link? Like if you buy a Bitcoin, do you own 1/200 millionth of the monetized value of blockchain technology? No, right? It's not the same type of direct link that if you buy one of 21 million shares of IBM, you own, in a relatively abstract but legally accurate way, 1/21 millionth of the future residual cash flows of IBM Corporation, subject to all types of conditions, the creditors above you in the capital structure and so on. You don't own that tangibly, but you own that you don't own it directly, but you own it indirectly. Because if the blockchain technology, the Bitcoin network, the Bitcoins are needed to do something that people want to do, they will be more valuable. And there will be some correlation between the value of a Bitcoin and how many people want Bitcoins. I'm going to go to another question that touches upon this directly. There was a formula in the slides of the first class which states that a valuation for Bitcoin would be, and by the way, we're not, I think, about to break any new grounds in corporate finance. This is a very conceptual valuation. I don't think you can take this to the bank and say the value of transactions conducted in Bitcoin divided by the velocity of money plus the discounted present value of the value of future transaction of Bitcoins divided by the future velocity of money. And there's something that called my attention is the following. If Bitcoin was used more as a medium of exchange, the value of the network would probably increase since the network itself would be more useful. But it's obvious the velocity of money would increase too, which seems like a contradiction before the formula. Indeed, I could not understand the formula. I would appreciate it if it could be explained. Before we answer the specific question, let's describe what this means. As we said a second ago, the more transactions are needed to happen on Bitcoin, the more people will buy Bitcoins. The more people will buy Bitcoins, the more inbound demand there'll be for Bitcoins, will probably rise the price. Now, if the velocity of money is how long you're holding on to your Bitcoins in the way that we're thinking about it in this formula. So if I just needed for a fraction of, if I needed for 2 minutes to send some money from the US to the Philippines, and then I'm cashing back out to some type of sovereign currency, the velocity of money is high. So that works as a negative towards valuation. If in order to X, I need to hold it for a day, or let's take another use case. Let's say your usage case is, I want at all times in my life to have 1,000 euros accessible anywhere I have an internet connection. I want a Bitcoin wallet accessible to me anywhere I have an internet connection. And the reason I want to do this is for some form of emergency. I need money. I'm somewhere in the world. I need it instantly. My bank account is in US. I'm in Uganda, and the ATM isn't working, and I need to spend 20 euros with someone right then. And obviously, for this to make any sense, people would have to want to accept Bitcoins. But let's say it's 10 years from now, and you can reliably believe that in any city, you can exchange Bitcoins for goods and services. In which case, this usage case is very interesting. It's actually a usage case I would consider to be valid. Of course, I don't think I'd move my main bank account to my Bitcoin wallet, but having 1,000 euros or 2,000 euros or 500 euros available at any time, regardless of how any bank network is working, just your only assumption being that the internet is working, seems like reasonable type of preparatory work for any number of things happening. Well, on that usage case, the velocity of money is infinite, right? Like if you don't need it, you buy here, someone's going to say, I buy 1,000, or sorry, 1 divided by infinite. Like there's no, your holding period is indefinite. So, or however long you're going to live. You go buy 1,000 euros worth of bitcoins because you want to have it around. So long as you don't have an emergency, you just leave it there. So the really correct way to look at this formula is to say that the value of transactions and the velocity of money of transactions conducted in Bitcoin will vary by the type of application. So if it's remittances, it might be a few minutes or hours. If it's emergency digital cash, it might be decades that you have it tied up there. And so if you look at this formula and say, very different usage cases happening here, then it's not so quite a contradictory link. There's more of this one, but there's less of this one. And by the way, even if the number of trends, even if you start using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange a lot, there's some parts of the versions of the future world where you are going in and out of Bitcoin all the time. There might be other ones if Bitcoin has fairly stable value, fairly stable relative to other currencies, that you might think to yourself, I don't want to pay the commission fees to exchange back and forth every single time I want to do a transaction. I'm just going to hold a couple $100 of Bitcoin for Bitcoin type transactions. Just like if you go to France and you're from the US and you want to spend in euros, you're probably not going to translate back, convert from dollars to euros every single time you want to buy a baguette. You'll convert $500 into euros when you first get there. You'll hold those euros during the whole time that you're there, and then maybe you'll convert on the way back. Or honestly, in my case, I go back and forth between the US and Europe a lot. I have some cash all the time in dollars and in euros. I don't even bother converting back because I figure I'm going to need it later. If that happens, if it's a medium of exchange for certain scenarios, and people say, you know what, I'm comfortable enough with the price stability that it's easier just to keep some money hanging around in Bitcoin, it's not even necessarily the case that the velocity will go up with the transaction volume. So to answer this question, I think it depends on the usage case. Some cases in some cases, transaction volume will go up, velocity of money will go up. In some cases, transaction volume will go up, velocity of money will go down. Some cases might be a mix. And the conceptual value of Bitcoin is kind of all these things together, all these thousands of usage cases with their own parameters matched up together. And so it's not a practical formula. I don't think you can actually go somewhere and plug in the numbers and come up with a valuation. But I think conceptually it is a useful way to think about it. When we say Bitcoin is possibly backed by a commodity, are we referring to the cost of production, i.e. energy, primarily? So I've read this theory a lot about that being a driver of Bitcoin value, that it's a way to exchange stored energy, in effect. And what they mean is the electricity for the mining needed to mine the blocks that generates the Bitcoin. I'm not sure that's accurate. I think it's missing. I think it has the causality backwards. So what do I mean by this? Let's say Bitcoin was exactly as it is today. And we say, yeah, look, the value of the stored energy is 15 billion. What's the market cap today? About 15 billion, George, I think something like that. And let's say tomorrow, all the world's global governments announce that anyone using a Bitcoin will be taken out on the street and shot, killed, executed. I think it's safe to say the value of Bitcoin would drop dramatically because everyone would Okay, $17 billion. Everyone would be in an extremely fast rush to sell their Bitcoins as soon as possible because nobody likes the idea of being executed. Now, that's interesting. If the value of Bitcoin had something to do with the energy used to create it, why would something that has nothing to do with that topic, why would something like that drop the value probably 95% in a matter of minutes? Right? I think it is primarily, and there's a good comment in the live chat, and I'll address it. The real answer is it's always, but always, supply and demand. Right? Its value is there because of the demand for its applications. The demand for its applications then converts to its value through something like this conceptual formula of how much money is used to engage in Bitcoin activities divided by the velocity of money. Yes, there's a lot of energy used to manage the transaction processing in Bitcoin, but that's there, I believe, to provide, it is there to provide security. It's there to make the Bitcoin work. It's an input. I don't think it's the driver of the value. Like, I think it's confusing the fact, like here on campus, we have 18 buildings that make up the university. And they're important, and we need them. We have classes in them. We have restaurants in them. A lot of concrete was used to make those buildings. Someone might argue, oh, is the cost of tuition of a degree of the University of Nicosia the monetized value of the concrete that was put in the buildings? Not really, right? Like, we needed the concrete to make the buildings to deliver the programs and what have you. But I don't think that's the driver of the value. I think the driver of the value is that there's a degree that people want for whatever reasons they want their degree, and they're willing to spend money on the degree, and then in order to fulfill that demand, fulfill that need, you need concrete. I believe with Bitcoin, the causality is that way. It's not like anyone has any need for stored energy in the form of solved puzzles, is what Bitcoin is if you look at it that way, if they don't do anything useful. Right? It'd be an interesting technical exercise. I could send my computer to solve a bunch of irrelevant puzzles and use up a bunch of energy, but no one would say, oh, great, this is super useful. I'd like to buy that from you. And I think it's there to make the system work. It's important to make the system work. It would give the system security. So without it, it would be valueless because you wouldn't have the security. You wouldn't rely on it. But I do think the causality is the demand drives the energy, and the demand drives the value drives the energy, not the energy drives the value, drives the demand. If that makes any sense. I have no idea how to answer this question, but I want to read it because it made me smile. Do you feel that digital currency will be needed and used if and when we start space travel? I don't know. It's very interesting. I've read some science fiction when we are conquering the galaxies, where they have something like slow money that feels conceptually something like Bitcoin. But I really have nothing intelligent to say on that question of if we're doing space travel, if we'll be doing it in Bitcoins. But I do like the sci-fi feel of we'll be traveling through the solar system and also trading cryptocurrencies at the same time. So I did want to read that to the group. All right, we're almost done with the questions. We have 2 more questions. First was, why did modern money come to replace primitive money? And the answer is very simple. It's much more effective and productive. Primitive money is, you are not going to imagine trying to run the global financial system on cowrie shells. Imagine if Goldman Sachs needed to trade trillions of dollars of currency, and the way they traded that currency is they send 18,000 semi-trucks filled with seashells in order to conduct their trades every hour, right? So I think just for very practical purposes, modern money is more efficient, more effective, and all the reasons you need money for. And why was digital currency introduced in the first place? Well, there's several digital currencies, both Bitcoin, but others. I think in the case of Bitcoin itself, I think it was a way to do effective payments online. There's some notes from Satoshi along those lines. George, I don't know if you can find the exact quote and drop it in the live chat. And I don't know if there were grander, if someone was, or Satoshi was as visionary to think that everything that would develop out of this, and if he was, that's very, very super impressive. But if he wasn't, it's still impressive. Sometimes many things outgrow their initial vision for themselves. So it makes a lot of sense to me that we have one of the things that I see Bitcoin being relevant for is a version of cash that can be used online. We don't have that. Everything we're using online is a layer up in the system, right? Credit cards or wire transfers. We're using things that are IOUs in effect. We don't have cash we can use online before Bitcoin. I also think Bitcoin, or something like Bitcoin, will be a primary way that machines exchange value with each other as machines become more intelligent, as machines engage in more activities. And by this, I don't necessarily mean, when the Terminator needs to go buy some new oil for his joints before he comes and destroys humanity. I even mean things like if you have spam filters that are using very, very small micropayments to filter access to an inbox, those are going to be machine-to-machine transactions. I cannot imagine those transactions happening in the existing financial system. Right? They're going to have to work with some, if not Bitcoin, something like a Bitcoin, or something like a sidechain on something like a Bitcoin. All right, I got to almost every question. I think I missed one. We are 6 minutes over, though, so I'm going to wrap up on those questions. We try and keep these on time so that people can plan their time that they spend. I want to thank the group for a great start. There's a very solid set of questions on the first module. I've been watching the live chat as it goes along, and it seems like a great group. I will be handing everyone over to Andreas Antonopoulos' extraordinarily competent hands for the next 6 sessions. And then hopefully you're still with us for session 8, that we can go through and complete the course. I have to tell you, we have had some of these MOOCs that have had the highest completion rate I have ever heard of in a MOOC. An average MOOC completes at 5%. We've had completion rates in the 25-30% range. I'd love to see this group beat that record. I'd love to see as many of you stay through the course as much as possible, get all the way through, get your certificate. It's a really neat set of skills you'll pick up. You will instantly become within the less than top 1%, top 1/10 of 1/10 of 1% of people globally knowledgeable on this topic. And we'd love to have you join our community in that regard. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great weekend, and I'll be back in touch with you in a few weeks.